Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had always known she was different from the other recruits at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California. At 26, she was one of only 3 women who had ever made it past the initial screening for the Elite SEAL training program. The morning sun cast long shadows across the beach where she stood with 47 other candidates, waiting for what their instructors had called the most important exercise of their training. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs as she adjusted the straps of her gear. 3 years of preparation had led to this moment. She had sacrificed everything, her relationship with her fiancé, time with her aging parents, and countless nights of sleep, to prove that she belonged among the most elite warriors in the world. The salt air filled her lungs as she watched the instructors gathering near the obstacle course that had been set up specifically for this evaluation. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb stood at the front of the group, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he surveyed the candidates. Behind him, 3 other instructors watched with calculating eyes. Sarah recognized them all: Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, who had pushed her harder than anyone else during weapons training, Petty Officer Thompson, whose disapproval of women in combat roles was barely concealed, and Petty Officer Blake, who had been surprisingly supportive throughout her journey. "Today's exercise will determine who among you has what it takes to wear the trident," Chief Webb announced, his voice carrying across the beach despite the wind. "You will work in teams of 4. Each team will navigate a series of challenges designed to test not just your physical capabilities, but your ability to work under extreme pressure, make life or death decisions, and trust your teammates with your life." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized she would be assigned to a team rather than choosing one herself. Throughout training, she had worked hard to build relationships with her fellow candidates, but she knew that some still viewed her as an outsider. The whispers had never completely stopped, conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room, doubts about her physical strength, questions about whether she could truly be trusted in combat. "Mitchell, Davis, Johnson, and Patterson, your Team Alpha," Chief Webb called out. Sarah's shoulders tensed as she looked toward her assigned teammates. She knew all 3 men well, but the expressions on their faces told her everything she needed to know about how they felt about this arrangement. Petty Officer Candidate Jake Davis was built like a linebacker, with shoulders that seemed to stretch his uniform to its limits. He had been cordial to Sarah throughout training, but she had always sensed an underlying skepticism about her capabilities. Tom Johnson, a former Marine with combat experience in Afghanistan, had made his views about women in combat crystal clear during late-night conversations in the barracks. And Rick Patterson, though generally friendly, had a tendency to take charge in every situation, often talking over Sarah when she attempted to contribute to group discussions. As the team gathered together to receive their mission briefing, Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Every other candidate was watching, waiting to see how the only woman in the program would perform under the ultimate test. She straightened her shoulders and looked each of her teammates in the eye, determined to show them the same confidence she had displayed throughout months of grueling training. "Your mission is to infiltrate a mock enemy compound, retrieve sensitive intelligence, and extract to the designated rally point," Chief Webb explained as he handed Davis a sealed envelope containing detailed instructions. "You will face live fire exercises, physical obstacles, and scenarios designed to test your decision-making under stress. The exercise begins in 30 minutes. Use that time to plan your approach." Sarah watched as Davis immediately took charge, spreading out the mission details on a piece of driftwood. The compound was located 2 miles inland, protected by a series of obstacles including a water crossing, razor wire, and what appeared to be multiple guard positions. The intelligence package was hidden in a central building, and they had exactly 4 hours to complete the entire mission. "Okay, here's how we're going to do this," Davis said, his finger tracing their planned route on the map. "Johnson, you take point on the approach. Patterson, you handle the technical aspects, locks, alarms, anything electronic. I'll coordinate overall movement and timing." He paused, glancing at Sarah. "Mitchell, you can provide rear security and carry the backup equipment." Sarah felt her jaw clench at the assignment. Rear security was important, but it was also the position typically given to the weakest member of a team. She had excelled in every technical training module, had some of the highest marksmanship scores in the class, and had proven her tactical thinking in previous exercises. But she knew that challenging the team leader's decision right before a crucial mission could create the kind of conflict that would doom their chances of success. "I think we should consider alternate approaches," Sarah said carefully, keeping her voice level. "If we split into two elements for the approach, we could create a distraction that might make the infiltration easier. I could take Patterson and create a diversion on the east side while you and Johnson approach from the west." Johnson shook his head immediately. "Too complicated. We stick to the plan Davis outlined. Simple is better in these situations." "But, if we analyze the guard positions here," Sarah continued, pointing to the map, "there's clearly a gap in their coverage that we could exploit if we coordinate our timing properly." "I've studied these kinds of scenarios extensively." "Look, Sarah," Patterson interrupted, "we all know you're smart. But, this isn't a classroom exercise. This is about real-world application, and some of us have actually been in situations like this before." The dismissal in his tone stung, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. She had faced this kind of attitude countless times throughout her military career, and she had learned that the best response was always to prove herself through action rather than argument. But, as she looked at the map, she could see potential problems with their planned approach that her teammates seemed unwilling to consider. As the 30-minute planning period came to an end, Sarah found herself questioning whether her concerns were valid or if the pressure of the moment was making her second-guess a perfectly reasonable plan. She had always been her own harshest critic, and the possibility that her teammates might be right about the simplicity of their approach nagged at her as they gathered their equipment. The team moved out in formation, with Johnson leading the way through the dense brush that separated the beach from their objective. Sarah took her assigned position at the rear, her eyes constantly scanning for threats while her mind continued to process the details of their mission. The weight of her gear felt familiar and comfortable, but the weight of expectation felt crushing. 20 minutes into their movement, they reached the first major obstacle, a fast-moving stream that was deeper and wider than it had appeared on their map. Johnson held up his hand, signaling for the team to halt while he assessed the crossing. Sarah could see immediately that the current was stronger than they had anticipated, and the opposite bank was muddy and steep. "We can cross here," Johnson whispered back to the team. "One at a time, using the rope technique we practiced." Sarah studied the water more carefully and noticed something that made her stomach drop. "Wait," she said quietly. "Look at the watercolor about 50 meters upstream. I think there might be a machine gun position up there that we missed in our initial reconnaissance." Davis looked where she was pointing and frowned. "I don't see anything." "The discoloration in the water," Sarah explained. "It looks like runoff from a fighting position. If there's someone up there with clear fields of fire over this crossing point, we could be walking into an ambush." "You're being paranoid," Johnson said. "We studied the enemy positions carefully. There's nothing up there." But Sarah's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She had learned to trust those instincts during her years of training, and they had never led her astray. The problem was that voicing her concerns again would make her seem like she was second-guessing every decision, undermining the team's confidence right when they needed to move quickly and decisively. "Maybe we should take just a few minutes to do additional reconnaissance," she suggested. "I could move upstream and get a better look while you prepare the crossing equipment." "Negative," Davis said firmly. "We're already behind schedule. We cross here and we cross now." Sarah watched helplessly as Johnson began rigging the rope system they would use to cross the stream. Every fiber of her being told her that they were making a mistake, but she had been assigned to a team role that apparently didn't include tactical input. She found herself in an impossible position: follow orders that she believed were dangerous, or challenge her team leader's authority in a way that could jeopardize not just the mission but her entire future in the program. As Johnson prepared to make the first crossing, Sarah noticed movement in the brush upstream. It was subtle, just a slight shift in the shadows that might have been wind, but her trained eye caught it immediately. She opened her mouth to call out a warning, but before she could speak, the distinctive sound of blank ammunition filled the air. The machine gun position she had suspected opened fire from exactly where she had predicted, and red smoke began pouring from Johnson's gear, indicating that he had been killed in the exercise. Within seconds, more positions opened fire from the opposite bank, and Patterson went down as well, red smoke marking him as another casualty. Davis immediately called for the team to take cover, but the damage was already done. In less than 30 seconds, their four-person team had been reduced to two, and their primary route across the water had been completely compromised. The exercise controllers would expect them to adapt and continue the mission, but their chances of success had plummeted. "How the hell did they know we were coming?" Davis demanded, breathing heavily as he pressed himself against the cover of a fallen log. Sarah wanted to remind him that she had tried to warn them about the upstream position, but this wasn't the time for recriminations. Instead, she studied their situation and began formulating alternatives. "We need to find another crossing point," she said. "And we need to move fast before they can reposition to cover other approaches." "There is no other crossing point," Davis replied. "At least not one that we can reach in time to complete the mission." But Sarah had been studying the map more carefully than perhaps anyone else on the team, and she had noticed something during their movement that might give them an option. About 300 meters downstream, there's a narrow section where the banks are closer together. "If we can get there without being detected, we might be able to cross without the rope system." Davis looked skeptical, but with half their team already eliminated, he had few alternatives. "Show me," he said. Moving carefully through the undergrowth, Sarah led Davis downstream while staying well back from the water's edge. Her heart was pounding, not just from the physical exertion but from the knowledge that the success or failure of their mission now rested largely on her shoulders. This was exactly the kind of situation she had trained for, but it was also the kind of high-pressure moment where a single mistake could end her dreams of becoming a SEAL. The crossing point she had identified was even better than she had hoped. The stream narrowed to about 8 feet at this location, and large rocks on both sides provided concealment and stable footing. More importantly, the position was hidden from the machine gun nest upstream, and the angles made it unlikely that the enemy forces on the far side could observe their movement. "This could work," Davis admitted as he studied the terrain. "But we'll need to move fast once we're across. Our timeline is shot, and we still have the main compound to deal with." Sarah nodded, already thinking through the next phase of their mission. With only 2 team members remaining, they would need to be smarter and more efficient than their original plan had called for. But she was beginning to feel confident that they could still succeed if they adapted their approach to their new circumstances. As they prepared to cross the stream, Sarah found herself thinking about all the people who had doubted her ability to succeed in this program. Her high school guidance counselor who had suggested she consider more traditional career paths. Her college boyfriend who had broken up with her because he couldn't handle dating someone who was more ambitious than he was. Even some of her fellow service members who had questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. But she also thought about the people who had supported her journey. Her parents, who had never once suggested that her dreams were unrealistic. Her commanding officer at her previous duty station, who had written the recommendation letter that got her accepted into the SEAL program. And Commander Harrison, the officer in charge of their training, who had made it clear that he judged candidates based on their performance, not their gender. The water was shockingly cold as Sarah slipped into the stream, but she forced herself to move smoothly and quietly toward the opposite bank. Behind her, Davis followed, and she could hear the soft splash of his movements as he worked to keep up. The current was stronger than it looked, and by the time she reached the far side, her muscles were burning from the effort of fighting the water while maintaining stealth. Once they were both across and had taken a few moments to check their equipment, Sarah pulled out the mission map and began studying their next move. The intelligence target was still over a mile away, and they would need to navigate at least 3 more obstacles before reaching the compound. With their reduced team size, every decision would be critical. "What's your assessment of our situation?" Davis asked, and Sarah was surprised to hear that his tone had changed. The dismissive attitude from earlier was gone, replaced by what sounded like genuine interest in her tactical opinion. "We can still complete the mission," Sarah said confidently. "But we need to change our approach completely. Instead of trying to replicate what a 4-person team would do, we need to use our smaller size as an advantage. We can move faster and take routes that would be too risky for a larger element." Davis nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" As Sarah began outlining her plan, she realized that this was the first time during the entire exercise that anyone had asked for her input in a way that suggested they actually wanted to hear her answer. The loss of Johnson and Patterson had been a setback for the mission, but it had also removed the team dynamics that had been holding her back from contributing fully to their success. Sarah's plan was audacious and risky, but, as she explained it to Davis, she could see him beginning to understand why it might work. Instead of approaching the compound from the expected direction, they would circle wide to the north, using a drainage ditch that ran almost to the perimeter fence. It would add precious time to their movement, but it would also allow them to avoid the majority of the defensive positions that had been established to counter a conventional assault. The key is timing, Sarah explained as they moved through the dense undergrowth. The guard rotations change every 20 minutes according to the briefing materials. If we can reach the north fence during the changeover, we'll have approximately 3 minutes when that section is unwatched. Davis had to admit that her analysis was thorough and well-reasoned. During their months of training together, he had certainly noticed that Sarah was intelligent and dedicated, but he had never really considered her as a tactical equal. The military had been his life since he was 18, and, like many of his peers, he had grown up believing that combat was fundamentally a male domain. But, watching her navigate their current crisis was forcing him to reconsider some of his assumptions. The drainage ditch was deeper than either of them had expected, which turned out to be both an advantage and a complication. The depth provided excellent concealment as they low-crawled through mud and standing water, but it also made their movement slower and more exhausting than they had planned. Sarah's uniform was soaked through within the first 50 meters, and the cold was beginning to sap her strength. But she pushed forward without complaint, her mind focused entirely on the mission ahead. Every few minutes, she would check her watch and adjust their pace to ensure they would reach the compound at precisely the right moment. The mathematics of military operations had always appealed to her, the way that careful planning and precise execution could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As they neared the compound perimeter, Sarah held up her hand to signal a halt. Through the murky water of the ditch, she could see the chain-link fence that surrounded their objective. Beyond it, a series of low buildings housed the intelligence package they needed to retrieve. But between them and their goal stood at least 6 guards, multiple layers of security, and a maze of obstacles designed to test every skill they had learned during training. "Guard change in 90 seconds, Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on her watch. "We need to be ready to move the moment they rotate." Davis nodded, checking his own equipment one final time. The wire cutters were secured to his vest, and his weapon was loaded with the blank ammunition that would simulate live fire during their assault on the compound. But he found himself thinking less about the technical aspects of their mission and more about the woman beside him, who had somehow managed to salvage what had seemed like a hopeless situation. The guard change happened exactly when Sarah had predicted it would. For precisely 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the northern section of the perimeter was unwatched as the outgoing guard moved to his next position and the incoming guard completed his approach from the opposite direction. Sarah and Davis moved like shadows through the gap, cutting through the fence and sliding into the compound with seconds to spare. Once inside the perimeter, they found themselves in a completely different environment. The buildings were arranged in a complex pattern that created multiple blind spots and potential ambush points. Worse, the intelligence briefing had been deliberately incomplete, there were defensive positions that hadn't appeared on their maps, and the layout was more complicated than they had been led to believe. "This isn't what we planned for," Davis whispered as they took cover behind a storage shed. "The mission parameters were always going to change once we got inside," Sarah replied. "That's the point of this exercise. They want to see how we adapt when everything we thought we knew turns out to be wrong." She was right, of course. SEAL operations rarely went according to plan, and the ability to think on your feet under extreme pressure was exactly what separated elite warriors from conventional troops. But, knowing that intellectually and experiencing it in real time were very different things, especially when the stakes were as high as they were today. Sarah studied the compound layout, comparing what she could see to what they had expected to find. The central building where their target was located stood about 50 meters away, but the direct route was clearly compromised by guard positions they hadn't known about. However, she noticed that there was a maintenance tunnel entrance near their current position that might provide an alternate approach. "Cover me," she said to Davis. I'm going to check something. Before he could object, Sarah was moving across the open ground toward the tunnel entrance. Her movement was smooth and confident, covering the distance in a matter of seconds and disappearing into the shadows beside the building. Davis found himself holding his breath as he watched for any sign that she had been detected. The tunnel entrance was unlocked, which struck Sarah as either incredibly fortunate or suspiciously convenient. In real-world operations, such easy access would immediately trigger concerns about traps or ambushes. But, in a training exercise, it might simply represent an alternate solution path that the instructors had provided for teams that were creative enough to find it. She slipped into the tunnel and began moving through the darkness toward what she hoped would be a position near the central building. The space was cramped and filled with pipes and electrical conduits that made movement difficult, but it was also completely concealed from the guards above. As she crawled through the maintenance space, Sarah began to feel confident that they had found a way to complete their mission despite the setbacks they had faced. The tunnel ended at a grate that opened into the basement of the central building. Sarah could see stairs leading up to the ground floor, where, according to their briefing, the intelligence package would be located in a secure office. But, as she prepared to signal Davis to join her, she heard voices coming from somewhere above. "I still can't believe they put a woman on one of the assault teams," one voice was saying. "This whole exercise is going to be compromised because they're trying to make some kind of political statement." Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice of Petty Officer Thompson, one of the exercise instructors. She had always known that some of the staff questioned her presence in the program, but hearing it stated so bluntly was like a physical blow. "Come on, Thompson," another voice replied. "Mitchell's scores are solid. She's earned her place here just like everyone else." "Scores on paper don't mean anything when the shooting starts," Thompson continued. "You mark my words, her team is going to fail this exercise, and then, maybe the brass will stop pretending that women belong in the teams." Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe slowly. She had faced doubt and skepticism throughout her career, but this was different. This was someone in a position of authority actively hoping for her failure, someone who was supposed to be evaluating her performance objectively. The knowledge that at least some of the instructors were biased against her from the beginning made every challenge seem even more insurmountable. But, as the voices moved away, Sarah found herself feeling something unexpected, not discouragement, but determination. If Petty Officer Thompson wanted to see her fail, she was going to have to disappoint him. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to let anyone else's prejudices determine her future. Moving carefully up the stairs, Sarah reached the ground floor of the building and began searching for the office that contained their target. The layout was confusing, with multiple corridors and rooms that seemed designed more to confuse than to serve any practical purpose. But, after several minutes of careful exploration, she found the secure office and began working on the electronic lock that protected it. The lock system was more sophisticated than anything they had encountered during training, requiring both a keypad combination and what appeared to be a biometric scanner. Sarah studied the device carefully, drawing on everything she had learned during the technical training portions of their program. After several minutes of analysis, she identified what looked like a bypass mechanism that would allow her to open the door without triggering any alarms. As she worked on the lock, Sarah kept thinking about the conversation she had overheard. How many of the instructors shared Thompson's views? How many of the other candidates? Had her teammates today been set up to fail with her on purpose, or was she being paranoid? The questions multiplied in her mind even as she focused on the technical challenge in front of her. The lock clicked open, and Sarah slipped into the office to retrieve the intelligence package. It was exactly where the briefing had indicated it would be, secured in a small safe that required only basic lockpicking skills to open. But, as she reached for the package, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Davis appeared in the doorway, breathing heavily from his movement through the compound. "We need to move," he said urgently. "I think they're starting to figure out where we are." Sarah nodded, securing the intelligence package in her gear and moving toward the office window. Their extraction route would take them back the way they had come, but she could already hear voices and movement that suggested the exercise controllers were adjusting the scenario to increase the pressure on them. "How much time do we have left?" Davis asked as they prepared to leave the building. "47 minutes to reach the extraction point," Sarah replied, checking her watch. "But, the route is going to be more difficult now that they know we're in the compound." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of blank ammunition began echoing from multiple directions around the compound. Other teams were apparently making their own attempts to complete the mission, and the defensive forces were responding accordingly. The chaos would provide some cover for their escape, but it would also make navigation more difficult. Sarah led the way back toward the tunnel system, but as they approached the maintenance entrance, she realized that their route was compromised. 2 guards had taken position near the tunnel entrance, making it impossible to retrace their steps without being detected. They would need to find another way out of the compound, and they would need to do it quickly. There, Sarah pointed toward a section of the perimeter fence that was partially obscured by a utility building. "If we can reach that position, we should be able to get over the fence and into the tree line beyond." It was risky. They would need to cross about 30 meters of open ground while avoiding detection by multiple guard positions. But, with their time running out and their planned escape route blocked, it was their best remaining option. Davis looked at the route Sarah had identified and felt his stomach tighten. In his mind, he was already calculating the odds of success, and they weren't encouraging. But, as he looked at Sarah's face, he saw something that surprised him, not fear or desperation, but calm determination. She had analyzed their situation, identified their best option, and was ready to execute it regardless of the risks. "On your signal," he said quietly. Sarah studied the guard positions one more time, timing their movements and looking for the optimal moment to move. The mathematics of the situation were complex, multiple moving variables that had to be calculated in real time. But this was exactly the kind of challenge she had been training for, and, despite everything that had gone wrong with their mission, she felt confident in her ability to get them both to safety. "Now," she whispered, and they began their sprint toward the fence. The next 30 seconds felt like hours. Sarah could hear shouts from behind them as their movement was detected, and the distinctive sound of blank ammunition filled the air around them. But, somehow, miraculously, neither of them was hit before they reached the fence line. Getting over the fence while under fire was another challenge entirely. The chain link was higher than it had appeared from a distance, and topped with razor wire that made climbing difficult even under ideal conditions. But, working together, Davis and Sarah managed to get over the obstacle and into the tree line beyond, where they finally had concealment from their pursuers. "Extract point is still 23 minutes away," Sarah said as they began moving through the forest. "But, I think we're clear of the immediate pursuit." Davis nodded, but he was thinking about more than just their current tactical situation. Watching Sarah perform under extreme pressure had been a revelation. Her technical skills, her tactical thinking, her ability to remain calm when everything was going wrong, it was exactly what he would want to see in any team member, regardless of gender. As they made their way toward the extraction point, Davis found himself reflecting on his own attitudes and assumptions. He had always considered himself to be fair-minded and professional, but he was beginning to realize that he had been carrying unconscious biases that had affected how he evaluated Sarah's capabilities. The woman moving through the forest beside him wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. "Mitchell," he said quietly as they paused to check their bearings. "Yeah? Good work back there. I mean it." Sarah looked at him with surprise, then nodded once before returning her attention to their navigation. It wasn't much, but it was the first time anyone had acknowledged her contributions without qualification or surprise. And, for the moment, that was enough. The extraction point was a small clearing approximately 2 miles from the compound, marked by orange smoke that would be visible to the helicopter that was scheduled to pick up the successful teams. As Sarah and Davis approached the designated area, they could see that they weren't the first to arrive. 2 other teams were already waiting, and both looked like they had been through significant ordeals during their missions. Sarah checked her watch and felt a surge of satisfaction. Despite all the setbacks they had encountered, they had completed their mission with 8 minutes to spare. More importantly, they had adapted to unexpected challenges and found solutions that had allowed them to succeed when failure seemed inevitable. It was exactly the kind of performance that the SEAL program was designed to identify and reward. But, as they moved into the clearing, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach sink. The other teams were staring at them with expressions that ranged from surprise to outright hostility. She could hear whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she came within earshot, and the body language of the other candidates made it clear that her success was not being celebrated. "I can't believe Mitchell's team made it," she heard one candidate saying to another. "I figured they would have been eliminated in the first hour." "She probably slowed them down the whole time," another voice replied. "Davis must have had to carry her through the whole mission." The comments stung, but what bothered Sarah even more was the assumption that her presence had been a liability rather than an asset. These men had no knowledge of what had actually happened during her team's mission, but they were automatically attributing any success to Davis while assuming that she had been deadweight. Davis, who had been checking his equipment, looked up and realized what was happening. For the first time, he was seeing the social dynamics that Sarah faced from her perspective, and he was surprised by how uncomfortable it made him feel. These were his peers, men he had trained with and respected, but their assumptions about Sarah's performance were completely divorced from reality. "Actually," Davis said loudly enough for everyone in the clearing to hear, "Mitchell was the reason we completed the mission. Her tactical planning and technical skills saved our asses when everything went sideways." The clearing fell silent, and Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She appreciated Davis standing up for her, but the attention felt almost worse than the whispered criticisms had. Every eye in the clearing was now focused on her, evaluating and judging her in ways that her male counterparts never had to endure. Before the uncomfortable moment could stretch any further, the sound of rotor blades filled the air as the extraction helicopter approached the clearing. The aircraft settled into the designated landing zone, and Chief Petty Officer Webb jumped out to begin collecting mission reports from each team. "Team Alpha," Webb called out, looking directly at Sarah and Davis. "Report." Davis stepped forward, but before he could speak, Sarah moved to stand beside him. Throughout the entire exercise, she had been relegated to secondary roles and supporting positions. But this was her moment to demonstrate that she belonged among the elite warriors who made up the SEAL community. "Chief, we successfully infiltrated the compound and retrieved the intelligence package," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "We encountered unexpected defensive positions that resulted in the loss of 2 team members, but we adapted our approach and completed the mission within the designated timeframe." Webb nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "What were the key factors that enabled your success?" Sarah glanced at Davis, who nodded encouragingly. "Flexibility in tactical planning, effective use of terrain features, and teamwork under pressure. When our original plan was compromised, we were able to identify alternate approaches that allowed us to achieve our objectives." "And the intelligence package is secure?" Sarah reached into her gear and produced the sealed container that held their target. "Affirmative, Chief. Package is intact and uncompromised." Webb took the container and examined it briefly before making another note on his clipboard. "Outstanding. Both of you report to the debrief room at 1400 hours for detailed mission analysis." As the chief moved on to collect reports from the other teams, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion wash over her. They had done it, not just completed the mission, but excelled under circumstances that would have defeated many other teams. But even in this moment of triumph, she could feel the weight of continued skepticism from some of the other candidates. The helicopter ride back to the base was quiet, with each team lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. Sarah stared out the window at the California coastline, thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few hours. The morning had begun with uncertainty about her place in the program, but she was ending the day with concrete proof that she belonged among the most elite warriors in the world. But she was also thinking about the conversation she had overheard in the compound, and wondering how many other instructors shared Petty Officer Thompson's views about women in combat roles. The success of one training exercise wouldn't necessarily change deeply held beliefs about gender and warfare, and Sarah knew that she would need to continue proving herself every single day. Back at the base, the candidates were given time to clean up and prepare for the detailed debriefing sessions that would analyze every aspect of their performance. Sarah took a long, hot shower, washing away the mud and sweat of the day's mission while trying to process everything that had happened. The physical challenges had been exactly what she had expected, but the social and political dynamics had been more complex than she had anticipated. As she was getting dressed, Sarah's roommate knocked on the door. Petty Officer candidate Lisa Chen was one of the other 2 women in the program, and she had been following Sarah's progress with intense interest. The success or failure of any woman in the SEAL program would inevitably reflect on all women who might follow, and the pressure of that representation weighed heavily on both of them. "I heard you completed the mission," Chen said with obvious relief. "How did it go?" Sarah sat down on her bunk and tried to summarize the complex emotions of the day. "We succeeded, but it wasn't easy. And I don't just mean the physical challenges. Some of the other candidates, and at least one of the instructors, they're not exactly rooting for us to succeed." Chen nodded grimly. "I know. I'd been hearing things too. Some people think this whole integration thing is just a political experiment, and they're waiting for us to fail so they can say, 'I told you so.'" "Then, we can't fail," Sarah said simply. "Not because we're perfect, but because we can't give them an excuse to shut the door on every woman who comes after us." It was a heavy burden to carry, the knowledge that their individual performance would be used to judge the capabilities of all women in combat roles. But it was also a responsibility that Sarah had accepted the moment she decided to pursue the most challenging military training in the world. The debriefing session that afternoon was conducted by Commander Harrison, the officer in charge of the overall training program. Unlike some of the instructors, Commander Harrison had a reputation for fairness and objectivity, and Sarah felt more comfortable discussing the details of their mission with him than she would have with someone like Petty Officer Thompson. "I want to go through your mission timeline step by step," Commander Harrison began, spreading out maps and mission materials on the table. "Start with your initial planning phase and walk me through every decision point." For the next 2 hours, Sarah and Davis provided detailed accounts of their mission, explaining not just what they had done but why they had made specific choices at critical moments. Commander Harrison asked probing questions about their tactical decisions, their problem-solving processes, and their teamwork under pressure. Sarah was impressed by the depth and sophistication of the analysis. Every aspect of their performance was being evaluated, from technical skills to leadership potential to psychological resilience. It was clear that the SEAL program was interested in developing complete warriors, not just physically capable.